And the cataphracts, they withdraw to a more strategic location that affords Serenus an overview of the unfolding battle. This is where we enter phase.
So the cataphract actually didn't make an impact against Roman formation, right? You start charging, but then you kind of wheeled around.
Precisely. And I think this was part of Serenus' original plan. I think it was simply there to
intimidate,
to play on the to sort of play on the Roman expectations, and that this battle was going to be unlike anything that the Romans had imagined. So we now enter phase 2 of the battle, and it is also here that Serenus, as he withdraws his cataphracts to a more strategic location that favors an overview, it's also here that Serenus instructs his baggage staff to make preparations for deploying out to the battlefront, and to do so in a way that is not visible to the Romans. Likely doing this by sending a company of 10 camels at a time for each banner, and so to keep the firing and rearming cycle smooth and near infinite. And the horse archers, they're discharging arrow after arrow, and the anti-armor properties are already visible as Romans at the forefront are getting wounded. Even so, the arrows rather wound than kill. The Romans deploy in their typical shield wall formation, or in a testudo. Of course, we associate the testudo more with the imperial style shields, but there's no reason that we could discount a sort of a shield wall formation, even with these Marian Reform style shields. So they would be anyway deploying that sort of shield wall to protect them against the hailstorm of arrows. So in spite of their losses, this is not an unsound defensive tactic that they have assumed, because at some point the Parthians must run out of ammunition, right? I mean, that's the idea. And occasionally the light Roman troops would make attempts to scatter the Parthian bowmen, but this is of course to no avail. The Parthian light cavalry is much swifter, the horse breed is simply superior and more well drilled than any other type in the Mediterranean, and the horseman is far more able as a soldier and can fire his bow while turning back, and this would be the famous Parthian shot. So the Roman light troops realized that attacking the bowmen without support is folly and quite suicidal. The range of the Parthians also means that the Roman javelins have no chance of giving a reply to the Parthian arrows. And the Parthians are not running out of ammunition. It's actually the opposite. The whole tactic of waiting out the Parthians is a failure, really, and one that the Romans simply couldn't foresee. They couldn't have foreseen this. And the initially clever Roman square has subsequently turned into a death trap where the Romans are fixed in position and now are unable to move, because now damned if they do and damned if they don't, as evident as their attempt to scatter the Parthian horsemen through light cavalry or light troops has shown. So Roman casualties are mounting, and the situation is getting increasingly desperate. And the dry and hot climate is really just speeding up the process.
So basically, right now, the rather than offering them the protection, the Roman rectangle square shield wall became immobilized, while the Parthian horse archer just riding around them, firing at will, and because the armor-piercing arrows, those arrows sometimes can go through the shield. So Romans are quite helpless. They're just kind of just waiting to be pincushion.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's another caveat to this. I mean, there's only so much strength and discipline to a Roman soldier before he's going to get broken down. I mean, he has to hold up a rather heavy shield and watch his buddies get nasty wounds that staple their hands to their shields and their feet to the ground. And if that wasn't enough, sometimes there would be squadrons of heavy cavalry of the Parthians deployed to aid in dispatching the Romans by breaking up those shield walls, by harassing their lines. So if the Roman is tremendously suffering, the Parthian, in contrast, is barely breaking a sweat. And this is very important to have in mind, that the Romans are still outnumbering the Parthian by a factor of 4. So the fact that the Romans are already struggling while having that many troops struggling, while the Parthians at 4 times less the size are barely breaking any sweat. This is significant to have in mind how the tactics have played out.
Yeah, this is also the difference between like mobile mounted archer versus infantry, because just the mobility that the horse archers have sometimes make them seems to be present at all places at all time. Because
Indeed.
they can just ride around you and shoot you from all directions, whereas you are kind of helpless as an infantry at this point. Even like, because a lot of battles between sedentary cultures, which can field a large amount of men, versus horse-centric, say, nomadic army, is that the nomads or the horse archers, they are fewer in numbers, but they make up for it in mobility, because they're just like they're basically performing dances around you on horses while showering you with arrows, while you have very little way of replying. So in that situation, your number don't help you. It's just
spot on. I mean, what else is there to add to that? That is spot on. I mean, here's the thing: the Parthian light horse has light equipment. I mean, he is his namesake. This is making it all a breeze, and he's not exactly unfamiliar to dry and hot climates. Now contrast this to the heavy infantryman of the Roman, who has to wear armor, and he has to carry javelins, and he has to have a heavy sword, and he has to carry this cumbersome shield, and then he is compelled to assume a defensive position in a rather claustrophobic position. It is going to take a lot on their fatigue. They're going to get fatigued at some point anyway. So the Parthians, this is a little bit of a aside here, but the Parthians also have a habit of wearing kohl around their eyes, which some have commented gives some protection against the sun's rays. Now, I don't know the veracity of this.
What is kohl?
Kohl is kind of like an eyeliner. It's kind of like an eyeliner that's made up from a galena extract. Now, I don't know the veracity of how efficient kohl is, because, well, I don't wear any freaking eyeliner. But it is an interesting detail to have in mind, that the Plutarch makes light of details like this to describe how well prepared the Parthians are. Now, Serenus himself is described as wearing cosmetics and to have parted his hair in the Median or Persian fashion, reflecting a prevalent Parthian aristocratic taste. Now, with all this said, the cataphracts are, of course, the exception. As we know later in antiquity, they're called ovenmen for a real reason. That's because in a hot climate, they must be feeling like hot ovens. Still, so far, they have performed admirably. Now, Crassus at some point must have understood that something was up, because the Parthians are not letting up, and the casualties have mounted to the levels where something had to be done. And obviously, the Parthian horse archers are not getting, I mean, their ammunition is not getting depleted. They still keep firing and firing and firing. So his son Publius Crassus is eager to attack the Parthians and to take the battle to them. So he prepares to muster a force of between 5,500 and 6,000 men. Now, among them are the 1,300 cavalry, out of which 1,000 were the Gallic horsemen, and 8 cohorts of Roman infantry, which would be roughly 4,000 men, or slightly below, and 500 archers. So somewhere between 5,500 and 6,000 men in total. Now, to put the numbers in perspective, this is a rather substantial force, containing an eighth of the light troops, more than a quarter of all the Roman cavalry, and arguably the best horsemen of their army, and roughly an eighth of all the core infantry. And now we're going to enter phase 3, because now Publius Crassus is leading the counterattack. Now, Garrett Sampson admits to not knowing which direction, but I have come to believe from my own research that it comes from the Roman left, that is, the Parthian right. The terrain to the northeast better corresponds to the topographical details given by Plutarch rather than to the southeast. Now, Serenus would have expected this to have happened at some point, and a great portion of the Parthian forces quickly withdraw at the sight of Publius breaking out. It is possible that there are some losses sustained in this, but we're not given any further details, so it can't be particularly significant. Now, this is, of course, a feigned retreat that the Parthians are staging here. And this is an old trick. Publius pursues the Parthians, and because his forces is a mixture of types, somewhere along the line he gets detached from the rest of the troops who can't keep pace with his cavalry. He's well motivated and full of fighting spirit. However, even he understands that the coordination of his forces has broken, and they are now isolated and enveloped by the pursued Parthians who have now wheeled around. And truthfully, this is just the beginning of a massacre that's about to happen. And before Publius fully understands his situation, he is now faced before a massive charge from Serenus cataphracts, and believe me this, they are not faking anything this time around. And the cataphracts, they're now smashing into Publius' cavalry like a moving iron wall, like a hot butter through, like a hot knife through butter. And the Gallic cavalry, in spite of their numeric advantage, are simply slaughtered. They stand no chance in this. Now, Plutarch makes a glowing record of Gallic bravery, enumerating desperate tactics like holding the Parthian lances and vain attempts at wrestling down their heavier Parthian opponents and sacrificing their own horses to charge, only to dive under the armor of the Parthian horses to stab them in the belly. But even Plutarch describes how the Gallic spears essentially were as efficient as toothpicks against Parthian armor, who in contrast have no trouble killing the quote-unquote naked Gauls rather easily. Now, with all of this said, the Gallic cavalry are outclassed, not just in type, but in quality. The Parthian cataphracts simply have superior armaments and superior training. They are the superlative horsemen of antiquity, with the proven record of beating the Seleucids, the Bactrians, the Sakas, and the Armenians, all of whom held good reputation in horsemanship. The Gauls, mounted on smaller horses and being unarmored, were just chanceless from the start. Let's be perfectly honest. The cataphracts suffer minimal casualties, while the Gallic cavalry is near annihilated and forced into a rout. This itself reflects the situation of Publius' infantry and the auxiliaries, who are really not faring any better. The Roman counterattack has now failed and is now poised before total destruction. Now, Publius, along with his officers, Censorinus and Megabacchus, opt for suicide than to be captured or killed by their Parthian opponents. And of this Roman detachment of 5,500 to 6,000 or so men, more than 5,000 are killed and less than 500 are taken prisoner. Publius' body is eventually found, and Serenus decides that the victory of this battle within the battle should be commemorated by decapitating Publius and putting his head on a pike. Now,
this must be a major blow to the Roman morale. I mean,
Indeed.
Publius himself, is actually a quite capable commander, right? He's known for his bravery. And also, but the feign retreat that the Parthian employ is just a classic tactic of like a horse archer, like the army from Central Asia,
Yeah.
or the people who had adopted that kind of Central Asian fighting tactic, but at the same time, even if you know that might be feigned retreat, in the heat of the battle, can you imagine how hard it is to stop your men from pursuing a retreating enemy? I mean, like when you are like when your men are full of battle lust, they see the enemy is in full retreat in front of them. The impulse is just to pursue, the Daniel's torpedoes full speed ahead, and that's why this tactic has proven successful again and again and again. Also be pointed out, to actually carry out such feign attack required quite a bit of a discipline on the part of the forces who are designed to lure in the enemies, because otherwise you could turn into a real...
it could turn into a real rout. I mean, there is a point when this feign retreat was hanging in the balance. This is something most commentators fail to understand, that when you have armies that operate according to command chains, coordination and having that coordination work smoothly is really the key to have everything work out as planned. And there's always a very real risk that everything could just go to shit. Everything can just break down. So the fact that the Parthians got away with this, with minimal casualties, I should add, is a testament to their discipline, not only as horsemen, but as soldiers. Very important to have in mind. And now that we have this blow to the Roman morale, it's really important that during this entire phase, that phase 3 of the battle is played out, Crassus is also waiting reports for how the battle goes, because, as I mentioned before, the command structures behind each contingent relies upon messages getting relayed back and forth in order to get reliable updates. We often forget how communications have to be relayed to and from certain positions to give proper updates of how the battle goes. So incidentally, half of the Parthian army is also still busy harassing the main Roman army in order to keep them in place. This gives Surinus some breathing space to reorganize his forces and to resume his tactics from phase 2. And Crassus, of course, grows more anxious and eventually orders a general advance towards the direction of Publius, still unknowing of his fate. Now, before he can move on for too long, the Parthians have gathered to their original position with the full array in sight. Now, the drama unfolds here. A lone horseman of the Parthian camp rides before the Romans holding a lance with Publius' severed head, extolling the bravery of a son sired by a father as cowardly as Crassus. And this tidbit, though it is amusing and dramatic, is a little bit incredible now, unless Crassus had an interpreter fluent in Parthian with him. Nevertheless, this did unnerve the Romans. They had sent a detachment that outnumbered the retreating Parthians, and the Parthians had barely suffered any losses, while that detachment was completely lost. And Crassus, however, kept it together. He was attempting to rally his forces with a reasonably stirring speech. However, his troops were just really fed up with the entire situation. They got wounded, straying everywhere. Their cavalry got wiped out, and even if they had archers, 500 had just gone to shit. The situation doesn't look very good for them. But Crassus, anyway, gets to finish his speech and to somewhat restore the flagging morale of his troops, but barely. The Parthians begin their horrific soundscape of drums anew, and the Parthian cavalry are now restocked with arrows, now begin to surround the Roman square again. and this time with much greater impunity and less risk posed to them, given that the light cavalry of the Romans had been largely disposed of. And now, greatly heartened and inspired by the triumph against Publius Crassus, the attacks get much more brazen, and the cataphracts, now frenzied after their battle with the Gauls, are now mounting sorties where they charge the demoralized Roman lines with increasing ferocity. And Plutarch describes this series of charges as having the power to impale 2 soldiers in one strike. And that's about as dramatic as a description can go. So at some point, the Roman army was at a breaking point. And the fact that they didn't break is actually a testament to their good discipline and cohesion. Even at what must have been over 10,000 killed in action in the first day, the Romans still kept a force of little more than 20,000 men, though over 4,000 of them were wounded, leaving approximately a force of 15 to 16,000 men still able to fight. Now, the Romans had taken a severe beating in this engagement and effectively been halved in fighting efficiency, but they were not annihilated. Now, they would have been, if not for the coming dusk and the Parthian disinclination, if one wills it, to fight in the night, or at least fight in the dark. So they were withdrawing to their camp, sending message that Crassus would be given one day to mourn the loss of his son, unless he would rather consent to be taken prisoner and to confer matters with King Orodes for peace. Now, Serenus was interested in ending the war and not to see it prolonged, and there was a great prestige in capturing the foremost Roman in battle. The Romans, however, made for a problematic retreat to the town of Carrhae, and were faced with the decision to leave behind the seriously wounded, numbering 4,000 men, to the whims of fate. Now, this is a terrible decision, and for those who are left behind, this is of course certain death. Crassus sends a detachment of his remaining cavalry, 300 in number, to prepare the garrison at Carrhae for the arrival of the main Roman army. Now, what happens is that those 300 cavalry, led by a certain Ignatius, decide that this is all bullshit. We don't want any more of this. So they desert from their responsibilities after they inform what's up to the garrison commander Coponius.
So they get right back to Carrhae and inform the garrison commander of the Roman defeat, but instead of going back to the battle, which they definitely do not want to do, they just decide they had enough. That's it. They done their duty, which was to inform the commander of their defeat, but they're not going to go back there to get
exactly. I mean, they just fuck off from there, essentially. So they just think, oh, what's it to us anymore? So Coponius, the commander of the garrison at Carrhae, senses that something really bad has happened. So he sends out an expedition to locate the retreating army and help it back into safety. Now, the bulk of the Roman main army reaches Carrhae successfully, but there is also a large number of stragglers who get lost. And for the Parthians, it doesn't really matter because they spend the night just recovering. It has been a good day of battle for them. So at the break of dawn, the Parthians, they don't waste any time. They just swiftly ride out, and the stragglers are really not difficult to find. And this is where light cavalry is deadly, as they pick off stragglers one by one. So the Roman stragglers are swiftly dealt with, and at some point Serenus comes across the gathering of the 4,000 Roman wounded who were left behind. Now, the severity of their wounds mean that they can't be taken prisoner, especially at such a critical stage of day 2 in the battle, where the capture of Crassus was priority number 1. So what happens is that those 4,000 Roman wounded are simply killed. And that's probably the most merciful thing to do at this point, given that they were stranded in the middle of nowhere without any means to get away. So, in another instance of catching up with stragglers, the Parthians catch up with a detachment of less than 2,000 Romans, or 4 cohorts, led by an officer named Vargunteus, who had made a last stand at a hillock. Now, Vargunteus' 4 cohorts were chanceless, but they took the more dignified route to their demise, showing great defiance and bravery, which earned them respect from the Parthians. And finally, when only 20 of them remained, they were allowed to withdraw without harm. Now, Serenus, with his forces fully united and having dealt with the stragglers, now stands before something of a little dilemma here. Now, he knows that Crassus can't have gotten that far away with his army in such a state. They must have taken shelter somewhere. I mean, it's not like a bunch of birds that have scattered everywhere. So Carrhae is a candidate to look for due to its proximity. But this is not an obvious choice if one puts oneself into Serenus' shoes, because garrisons existed elsewhere, not least in Nicephorium, in Icna, in Dapana, everywhere, But he receives a report, according to Plutarch, allegedly that Crassus was not in Carrhae, specifically not in Carrhae, and that he had made for the border. This is, of course, suspicious. The border was still days away. And the specificity of where Crassus wasn't was dubious, to say the least, and smacked of misinformation that rather made Serenus believe the opposite was true. Now, to confirm his own belief, he again resorted to tactical savvy. He sent a message to Carrhae relaying that he desired to hold a peace conference between himself and Crassus. In exchange, there would be truce, and the Romans would be guaranteed a safe withdrawal. Now, we have to understand that Serenus already knows he has won the engagement, but he wants to win the war. Getting the Romans out of Parthian territory was a priority, but if Crassus slips past him, that would constitute a failure and a continuation of hostilities. If Crassus slipped back into Roman Syria, it would only be a matter of time before Crassus regained his strength and set out to avenge his losses. Now, to avoid a future problem and to solve the matter at hand, Crassus had to be taken, preferably alive. Now, Cassius, the eternal bonehead, gives reply to Serenus' messenger, saying that Crassus would be willing to meet him. Now, you can imagine how overjoyed Serenus was at trusting his instincts. Crassus was in Carrhae all holed up, and now the cat wasn't going to let the mouse slip away. Seleucus, knowing his region all too well, must have informed Serenus that Carrhae at this time of the year was not boundless in resources, and that hosting an army of some 15 to 20,000 men, especially in a season before the harvest, was going to deplete supplies at a staggering rate.
Now I have a question. So
Sure thing.
Why was Cassius the one that responded to Serenus' offer for peace conference? Wouldn't Cassius himself still be making decisions at this point?
This is a really good question. And a clue is actually provided in Plutarch as he details how Crassus' first night quartering in Carrhae was seen visibly distraught and not really in a position to take command. It is also here that Plutarch describes that it was Crassus' deputies who largely took over parts of the executive leadership, so to speak. So this also probably explains how Cassius got emboldened to the degree that he now could answer in the name of Crassus, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
That makes sense because Crassus is, on one hand, he's suffering just a devastating defeat, and on the
Yes.
other hand, he also lost his son. So yeah, I can imagine his mental state at this point is probably, not not the greatest. Okay.
Worse, Cassius' stupidity. Now that we had mentioned how Cassius had confirmed Serena's gut feeling, his instinct that Crassus was holed up in Carrhae all along, Cassius' stupidity had now severely crippled Crassus' options and invited an enemy who is now at an impunity to sit and wait him out. The Roman leadership was now clearly failing because of the factors that I mentioned previously. However, the Roman leadership also convened and agreed to make for a withdrawal to the Syrian or Armenian border. Now, this without knowing that Orodes, the King Orodes, had already won Armenia at this point, and that this supposed withdrawal would be done under the cover of night, knowing that the Parthians were not in the habit of operating in the night. And this is a risky decision given how quickly Serenas had caught up with them and found them holed up at Carrhae. But, the situation is dire and something has to be done, and if something has to count, it is that they still outnumbered the Parthians. They were not completely defenseless. So they agree to retreat separately and in different directions in order to distract the Parthians. Now, this is where we can really start to criticize the option of retreat itself, that instead of retreating in one piece, retreats were being done in partition. One can see where they came from, but in hindsight, it proved to be perhaps a mistake. Now, Cassius, who we have now spent some time deriding, took a larger contingent, likely over 5,000 men, and headed for the Syrian border, but he sensed that his guide was leading them into a trap, and subsequently retreated back to Carrhae when all the other Romans had retreated without informing Crassus of this deviation in plans. So Cassius is actually deserting. I mean, this is an act of desertion. And let's also be frank here, Cassius is singularly the most weaselly character in this entire ordeal. And Garrett Sampson, too, calls this desertion of the highest order. Now,
so basically, all the Romans have departed Carrhae, except Cassius doubled back and went back to Carrhae, while the other. So, but where's Crassus? Was Crassus with the Cassius contingent, or was Crassus among the
Crassus
Romans who
had already departed. He had departed with a separate contingent. So it can get a little bit confusing dealing with the chronologies here, but it is heavily implied that Cassius had departed from Carrhae, but later returned when no one else was there. So by the time Cassius had departed, possibly everyone else had departed, but he returned to Carrhae anyway. And at some later point when...
I can just see the light bubble at the Roman leaders conference. People were probably thinking, okay, so if we all stay together, we're just going to be all killed together. But if we split up, now the Parthian would have to decide which group to pursue. So individually, we actually increase our chance of escape. There's a chance.
Exactly.
That Parthian pursue the other group, and then I may get away.
Exactly. And it's not really bad on paper, but the way it's executed is just shambolic, you know. But anyway, Serenus does note at daybreak that the Romans have escaped and orders his cavalry to search for the Romans. This is before Cassius decides to return back to Carrhae, of course. But the Romans have anyway, most of them have largely made for a hilly region called Sinaca. Now, no one has, to my knowledge, been able to locate Sinaca, but based from my own original research into the matter and from a tidbit recorded by Strabo, the geographer Strabo, Sinaca lay at the foot of Mount Masius, a montane region approximate to the ruins of Tigranokerta, the former Armenian capital and the namesake of Tigranes the Great of Armenia. Now, I have located Sinaca itself at today's Senocak in modern-day Turkey. The terrain is quite uneven and hilly and not well suited for cavalry operations, so it wasn't a poor choice for the Romans to have opted for this route. Now, the Romans have not quite reached Sinaca, and Serenus manages to catch up to a substantial Roman force of approximately 15,000 men in total. Crassus still commanded the whereabouts of 10,000 men, while his deputy Octavius, leading 5,000 men, observed the unfolding situation from higher ground and decided to join together with Crassus, now without thinking of his safety or that of his troops, many of whom were likely disgruntled with this decision that put them in harm's way. Now, Serenus realizes that this terrain is less than ideal for his cavalry, and that it is here that Roman numbers may count for something. Crassus had a real chance of slipping away, so Serenus tries one last tactic. Being the eternal tactician that he is, he now went himself and conveyed the message that he sought to have a peace conference. This is the second time the Romans get to hear this offer. Actually, a third time if one really goes back further in time when the Parthian embassy met with Crassus in Antioch, or fourth, I've lost count personally. Now, Crassus, of course, understands that this is a ruse, but the ordinary Roman soldier sees it very differently. Crassus had put them in harm's way, and it was due to his own deceit and avarice that he had gotten them all into this nightmare. And the Parthian wanted peace, not once, not twice, but now 3 times, and Crassus had gotten them into this caper. You know, I mean, he had gotten them into this bundle of bullshit. And this is how the Roman mutiny at Sinaca begins. The Roman troops simply demanded and made Crassus go and parley with Serenus. They made him do it. After all, Serenus' perspective could not be gainsaid or disputed. He had beaten the Romans and come with an offer of peace and to end the war. For the Romans, that war had turned into a horrific catastrophe. And this is where Plutarch finally assumes a modicum of fairness towards Crassus in a recorded exchange between Crassus and his senior officers, which is something like the following. Quote, "Let the world know that I perished because of the deceit of my enemies, and not that because I was delivered there by my own countrymen." End of quote.
Well, this is where the interest of the Roman common soldiers and their commander Crassus diverge, because Crassus, as a seasoned commander, he clearly could see that the so-called peace offering is a ruse, because the Serenus and his Parthian army already had Roman forces at his mercy. At the point, to offer this seemingly very generous peace offer, It's just another way of getting the Roman commanders delivered to his doorsteps.
Exactly. And here's
but the Roman
yeah,
common soldiers don't see it that way because they're getting sick and tired of this war because they know they have lost. They just want to go home.
they just want to go home, and who can blame them? I mean, who can blame them at this point? And here's the thing. With these words, of course, Crassus still wants to play it a little bit cautious. So first he sends two legates, the Roscius brothers, to establish a form of protocol. Now, they don't return. They are presumably taken prisoner by Serenus. Now, this does not help things. Crassus is basically compelled by his own troops to move on forward on foot, perhaps because he has lost his horse or whatnot, but he goes there together with his other senior officers, Octavius and Petronius, to meet with Serenus and Sylacus, the satrap of Mesopotamia, and Exathres, also known as Promaxathres in the account by Plutarch, and the rest of the Parthian military command consisting of the Chiliarchs, or the master of 1,000, as they would be called, who each led a banner, each consisting of 1,000 warriors. Anyway, Serenus now finally caught his mouse. But Serenus came to the parley on foot was even better. Now, upon seeing this, Serenus humorously remarks on the disparity of his party being on horseback while his is on foot, and sends for a spare horse for Crassus to mount. Now, there's a fair bit of dialogue going on here, in that Serenus seems keen to have some sort of arrangement, but we're unsure of what happens. But what we do know is that all of this turns into a scuffle, with the Parthian groom trying to goad on the horse to gallop into the Parthian side. And this leads, of course, to Octavius drawing his sword and cutting down the Parthian groom holding the horse. And the Parthians, not willing to tolerate this sort of insult, they cut down Octavius and Petronius and the rest of the Roman high command, saving Crassus for last. And Exathres, or Promaxathres, this Parthian noble and presumably high officer at Serenus' retinue, has the credit and the glory of killing Crassus and taking his head and right hand. Now, with this last gesture, Serenus had made short work of the Roman high command and sealed his victory. Now, Serenus had preferred to take Crassus alive, of course. One might even speculate that in killing Crassus, Serenus had paved his own path. However, the war was now entirely in Parthian hands, and the first token of that was his next action. Serenus addressed the remainder of the Romans perched at the hills to come down or otherwise be pursued. They would not have come to harm. Now, amazingly, a large number did so. The prisoner tally increased to a whopping 10,000 Romans. And the token of this great accomplishment included Roman flags and standards, fasces, trumpets, and all the Roman ornaments of war. In total, 20,000 Romans had lost their lives in action. 10,000 were taken prisoner, and less than 10,000 had made it back to Roman Syria. Plutarch says 10,000, but Appian says less than 10,000. This means that 3/4 of the Roman force was lost. The entire Roman command, except for Cassius Longinus, was wiped out. The Parthian casualties, in contrast, were minimal. The kill ratio and net efficiency of the Parthian force under Serenus was unprecedented. The conqueror of Seleucia, the crown giver, now had another triumph to add to his accomplishment. Now Serenus dispatches Seleucus and Exathras to send message to Orodes in Artashata with the remains of Crassus, that is, his head in his right hand. Serenus makes his way to Seleucia, that once pro-Roman city of Mithridates III, that usurper, the renegade king. Now he was planning his own spectacle, no doubt having gotten such information from his Roman prisoners, in the style of a Roman triumph, but in mockery of it. Serenus, who had to undo Greek conspiracy after another, was now thoroughly fed up with the Greek faction in the Parthian Empire, and the entire event was there to relay the following in no uncertain terms: not only that the Romans had lost, but the East was here to stay. This is a really important detail to have in mind, that this wasn't just simply some mocking parade. It was a message of a much greater magnitude. Now, in Armenia, Seleucus and Exathras reach Artashata. Orodes himself is triumphant, seemingly in a manner that implies a bloodless victory over his Armenian combatants. Artavasdes, the king of the Armenians, the ever anxious and vacillating monarch who attempted to play the Romans off against the Parthians, is likely shocked to hear of the Roman defeat, and worse, seeing the decapitated head of Crassus. In the midst of a play, Seleucus throws the head of Crassus into the stage, and the actor is made to pick it up, reciting the lines, and I quote, "We bring from the mountain a freshly cut tendril of ivy to the palace, a wonderful prey." The chorus then chanting, and I quote, "Who slew him?" Exathras, amused at this scene, sprang up to the scene, took the head of Crassus from the actor, and exclaimed, and I quote, "Mine is the honor." Now, needless to say, Orodes was delighted at this brazen improvisation by his own, elites. Artavasdes is, one can almost gather, he's much less thrilled about this development. He was compelled to save his own skin, and now that he had married off his sister to Pacorus, Orodes' son, the Parthian crown prince, he now stood before the very real headache that his brother-in-law was the Parthian crown prince. And Armenia had now been secured and brought back into the Parthian fold as it was during the age of Mithridates the Great, as we detailed in the previous episode. Now, back in Seleucia, Serenus threw a great triumph in the mock Roman style, dressing up a Roman prisoner who resembled the surly Crassus in woman's dress, and instructed him to repeat words that aimed to take hits at Crassus' masculinity and his greed. Songs were sung ridiculing the Romans, and these were essentially the old diss tracks of antiquity. Serenus, anyway, then went over to the Peleganes, the Seleucid Senate, and he was there to diss them as well. From the Roman loot, Serenus presented Greek works of erotica while ridiculing the masculinity of the Romans, who apparently needed such things for recreation. So it's just such a complete scene of throwing dissing, like just dissing not just the Romans, but dissing the Greeks for even putting their lots with the Romans, for starters. So by implication, he was signaling to the Seleucid senators that he was not going to tolerate their conspiring, and that with a single event he had summoned the will of the people at their expense. Now they needed to watch themselves.
Because right now, Romans and the Parthians were battling over all these buffer client state between them in East Mediterranean. And what Mr. Serena has done is to demonstrate to these Greeks that once for all, Parthian power is so overwhelming. Don't even think about it, like defecting to the Roman side.
Exactly. And he goes no expenses spared. I mean, it's probably because he has come across Crassus' baggage train. Crassus is the richest man in Rome, so it's probably that Romans are probably paying for this entire party that Serenus has been throwing in Seleucia anyway. So now when the triumph and the Arsacid sojourn in Armenia settled down, the matter of war still persisted. I mean, there was still not a truce. I mean, it's true that that Serenus had decided the war, but the war was still going on, technically speaking. There was no peace settlement yet. The Roman military machine in the east had been crippled, reduced to a trifling 10,000 men at most, or two understaffed legions without any clear command. It's not at all obvious that Cassius is the obvious leader of this. Antioch, the principal city of the Roman East, now lay at the horizon, virtually defenseless, and with it the Parthian goal of reaching Syria. If there ever was any opportunity to really seal the matter of the Romans in the East, this was a golden opportunity. And this especially given the network of alliances that we addressed in the previous episode. Especially given that network of alliances. The Roman East, quote unquote, is largely made up of client kingdoms whose loyalty now began to shift towards the Parthians. Serenus had managed to achieve a complete reversal of the situation in 54 BC, and now it was the Roman East that stood defenseless and ripe for attack. All this was accomplished with one single battle, and Serenus' name as the originator and the brainchild of this entire outcome was soaring in popularity. And for a monarch like Orodes, who murdered his father and murdered his brother to get his diadem, it now looked as if the diadem was paling in luster in comparison to the raging popularity of Serenus, who not only put that diadem on Orodes' head twice, but he also delivered Orodes' renegade brother to him. And now the seemingly invincible and the ever so capable Serenus had crushed the Romans using nothing more than a small army to achieve this, and with it deliver rings of Roman military commanders, the head of Crassus Senior and Crassus Junior, and their standards, and without as much as getting scratched. Further, he took as many prisoners as there were soldiers in his army. Was there anything the man couldn't do?
Now, this is a big threat to any reigning monarch when one of his powerful general, became more famous than he is and more popular.
Yes.
And that makes any ruler unease at that prospect.
And here's the thing. Unfortunately, the things took a much more grim turn. Orodes, whose entire struggle was down to his own insecurity on the throne of the Arsacid Empire, took the rise of Serenus as an alarm. And here's the catch-22 here. If Serenus wanted his crown, then Serenus was a danger. And if Serenus didn't want the crown, then surely he would remain kingmaker, and so Serenus would still be a danger. Serenus thus had to be killed. And with this, and I cannot emphasize this enough, this enormous blunder, rather than accepting the merits of Serenus' system, which was obviously the way of the future, the Parthian triumph had been undone with one single stroke. And we don't hear much of the Mesopotamian satrap Seleucus either. However, it is possible that he was demoted or replaced or simply reassigned, given that a murder would have clearly made the headlines. Anyway, the repercussions for this were going to be massive. And I think this is where a part 3 can shed some light on why the loss of this exceptionally talented commander set the tone for the coming years in the Roman-Parthian War. Also, I think it would be a good opportunity to address the matter of Roman prisoners of war and their fate for that episode.
You are talking about the long legend of the lost Roman legion that somehow made their way to China, right?
Exactly, and we are going to debunk the shit out of that, my friend. We're gonna debunk
that will
the
be part
living
3,
heck
my
out of it.
friends.
But that,
Stay tuned.
that's gonna be part 3. But I would also like to add the following thing here, just to take some time to address some of the usual rhetoric by casual commentators. And first, I address this because we're largely addressing the matter of the battle of Carrhae itself. Now, the first thing that's often brought up by casual commentators is the idea that a commander like Julius Caesar or Pompey would have performed radically different given the same situation Marcus Licinius Crassus was in. Now, I believe this view is not only misplaced, but it is a reflex on top of how misjudged the Battle of Carrhae has been in the Western historiography. There is a terrible tendency to view it as a Roman defeat, not as a Parthian triumph. And in reflecting this reflex on top of that series of myths, like how Crassus should have known better, this is how the ignorance keeps perpetuating. Of course, this is all nonsense. There is no inherent indication that tells us that Julius Caesar or Pompey would have performed differently. They are Roman generals of the classic Marian doctrine. Brilliant as they were, they were not invincible. And the failure in understanding what Serenus achieved and how he engineered a ferociously efficient anti-Roman army from a previously anti-Hellenistic Parthian army really injures common knowledge on this battle, but also obscures our own understanding for how the Parthians themselves made way for such innovations to be. Now, let me repeat. Crassus didn't lose because he was bad. Crassus lost because Serenus was exceptionally good, brilliant. Like, enough with the excuses and enough with the bullshit, The Parthians were great fighters with excellent cavalry, with a proven history of defeating the Hellenistic powers at their height. It is not a coincidence that they earned and forged an empire with influence spanning from the Euphrates to the Indus River Valley. Now, transplanting Julius Caesar or Pompey instead of Crassus isn't going to steal away Serenus' brilliant victory, nor remove his innovative and smart approach to warfare. It is, I would say, patently childish to assume otherwise, especially given what we today know of Romans increasingly co-opting Iranian-style cavalry and eventually giving preference to the cataphract than to the legionary infantry as the elite of the Roman army. Now, some might reply that Julius Caesar, for his tentative Parthian campaign, was going to bring more cavalry before he got murdered. But when you think about it, it sounds more like he was doing a Crassus 2.0, when Crassus was bringing more cavalry to address what he then believed would be a typical Parthian army. But of course, I leave this to the listeners to
I
judge.
have to point out, though, by the time that Julius Caesar was going to do the Crassus 2.0, there's no more Serenus. I mean, he definitely was one of the decisive factor in the battle itself.
True enough, true enough. But that's the thing about history. We don't really know. Serenus, for all his brilliance, is not the only brilliant Parthian commander. And this is something I would like to open up for perhaps future episodes in this podcast, if there's any interest in it. Because Serenus, even though he is criminally overlooked as he is already,
Yes,
he's also very often treated as the only brilliant Parthian commander. He is not. But now, for the second thing here, there is a tendency to overlook the mathematics of this entire ordeal and why Serenus' approach to warfare is criminally overlooked. Now, I cannot emphasize enough what Serenus has contributed to military theory. And I think the only reason why he hasn't been taken seriously is, and let's be honest, it's really down to a long time of anti-Oriental conceit and the inability to admit that the Roman military machine, with its quote-unquote universal infantry corps concept, had reached the limit of its capacity and its performing function. And I think it is illogical to think that infantry can compare in performance to cavalry in those conditions that we have outlined in this episode, or that those conditions magically change by switching out the commanders. I think the math itself, well, it really speaks for itself.
that
So
I agree. I mean, just by swapping out Crassus with Julius Caesar is not going to change the fact that he led a force mostly infantry against all cavalry force who just outclassed it in both armor, mobility, and pretty much everything else.
information warfare, not to say the least. The Romans lost because they had a different expectation of the Parthian army, and the Parthians won because they called that bluff and adapted accordingly. It is that adaptability. Adaptability is almost everything in warfare. But I have prattled on long enough. I think this is a very good way to finish this episode.
That was an excellent 2.5 hours worth of the epic battle of Carrhae, where for the first time the East and the West, represented by the Roman Republic and the Parthian Empire, clash in a decisive manner, and Rome would suffer its probably the worst defeat in centuries at the hands of the Persians. And we would definitely like to have you back.
Oh yeah,
because we're going to talk about the lost Roman legion in China. We're going to settle that once for all on this podcast.
Hey, I'm all glad to be here, and I'm going to look forward to be part of that episode as well. Thanks for having me, Carl.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, everybody else, thank you for listening, and please subscribe.